Hello and welcome to this session with me, Kevin Arrowsmith, Head of Service Innovation at Turnkey. And here we're going to be discussing how to plan your security and GRC change strategy for S4 HANA. So very quickly, a little bit about what we do. There are 5 different pillars that we offer, or service lines. So everything from governance, risk and compliance, from the process through to the technical implementations. We also support organisations with identity and access management, but also some of the cyber security aspects as well. There's also risk and controls in automation, but also there's elements around the application security, which this webinar is all about. Now, in this session, we're going to be looking at the approaches to S4 HANA. We'll be looking at the specific security challenges that S4 HANA brings. So what changes and what stays the same. So a few quite surprising elements that will come out of that. And then we'll give you a view from the coalface. So the common pitfalls, but also some of the implementation tips and tricks that you can take away and make a good impact in your organisations. So there are many different architectural approaches to S4 HANA. There's greenfield, brownfield, bluefield, Garfield. Whichever you choose, the security challenges may remain the same. Now, if we talk about the implementation approaches, and those are the images that you saw just previously, greenfield. Greenfield is classed as a new implementation of S4 HANA. Now, there's often a mix of data migration of existing content, but it is not really classed as a configuration migration. Now, greenfield can be deployed on-premise, or there are various cloud options available to you. But the way in which most organisations approach a greenfield is it's a way of starting again, leaving a lot of the rubbish that might be left behind in the ECC 6 system and starting again and redesign those processes. So it's a good way to start afresh. Now, brownfield, that is where it's technically classed as, a technical upgrade to S4 HANA. A lot of people class this as a bit of a conversion. So you're lifting and shifting some of your existing processes, your existing data from ECC 6, and then running with that with S4 HANA. Now, there are some considerations around that, and we'll go into that in a bit more detail. Now, the blue field that you will have seen just a moment ago, to be quite honest, it's a very successful marketing campaign, which really just blends a bit of the greenfield and the brownfield and a bit of a common sense approach, to be quite honest. So the greenfield. Now, the pros around the greenfield allows you to reevaluate your business processes so that you can improve them if needed. That gives greater opportunity to remove a lot of the heavy, clunky customization that's probably causing a bit of a cost of ownership problem. There are reduced test cycles because you're only looking at the actual changes you're implementing, not having to do a whole heap of regression testing. Then there's also clearer project accountability for the success. So, there's no one really having to be responsible to fix the old mess of ECC. Now, the cons to this, there's an increased need for a lot of business change management. The additional landscape that you're adding into the overall SAP estate, especially if you're trying to run that parallel with ECC, there's a bit of a consideration there and a bit of an additional cost. And there is a requirement right from the outset to secure that brand new box and new application that you are installing. There are some of the off-the-shelf options that SAP provide, but we'll talk through the rest of the presentation as to why, from a security perspective, there's an awful lot of holes that maybe it isn't necessarily the best option to go greenfield with a load of the standard processes and content that SAP provide. So we'll talk a little bit further in a bit more detail in a bit. Now, brownfield. A lot of people think this is potentially quicker to implement, almost over a few weeks or a few months exercise to simply, quote unquote, technically upgrade. It does allow some of the existing configuration that you've got in ECC. If you know you're going to need that in S4 HANA, you can lift some of that. And you can also move across a lot of the data and some of the processes. Now, that will reduce or potentially reduce the overall business change management that is required. And you can reuse some of your existing security concepts that you have in place. However, you do lose the opportunity to standardize and improve, especially where you know there's a lot of weaknesses around the ECC system. The customization that you've got is retained. So again, you have to assess, is that actually worthwhile us retaining, or should we start again? Now, there are a significant amount of processes, different access entry points in S4HANA, and an awful lot of changes to the underlying functional modules of S4HANA. So some of the functional modules have been merged, changed, or lost. So if you're hoping just to simply continue running with the processes as you do today in ECC, but you are impacted by the changes of the underlying functional modules, i.e. they no longer exist for a particular process, you have to redesign again. So where you think that brownfield we can just simply technically upgrade, there's still going to be an element of rework or redesign of your processes. And as then the follow-on impact is you have to then redesign the security concept and how you access these new functional modules. So if we look at the deployment approach, now there's a variety here. Now you can look at the cloud versus on-premise. Typically what a lot of organizations are doing is they're actually migrating their S4HANA systems into an Azure or an AWS type environment. So technically it still remains sort of on-premise. Now there's also a consideration here around the Fury gateway as to whether to centralize or embed it. Now the big benefit to having Fury is it helps to simplify the user experience, and that's a massive success criteria to an S4HANA project. So with the simplified user interface, you need to think about, well, where does that sort of user interface gateway sit? So you can opt for a centralized option, which is technically segregated away from the underlying S4HANA system. So any entry points that you're exposing to the internet, for example, that will then be sitting, that gateway, that centralized gateway will be sitting in a DMZ. So it is, from a networking perspective, more of a secure design. But you can go with an embedded option. Now the embedded option, that will sit directly on top of the S4HANA system. So you are technically, from a security perspective, exposing some of your S4HANA system to the public internet. So if there are any vulnerabilities that are not controlled well, you potentially are opening yourselves up to potential external threats. But if you go with a centralized model, there's more maintenance from a roles and access point of view. The embedded model reduces that, but increases the overall security risk. So really it needs a lot of thought as to whether you go centralized or embedded from a Fury gateway perspective. And then you have to think about, well, how much are we going to include in the same environment? So there are different things that you have to try and rationalize here around some of the co-hosting. So some organizations have multiple S4HANA systems and then try to centralize those. Others opt for just a single S4HANA system across the entire group, expecting all of the legal entities to feed into that. Then you have to think about some of the cloud applications that SAP bring, but also non-SAP. So things like the Workday, Salesforce. How do those then interact with S4HANA? So how are you then going to split some of those integration points with these cloud applications? Now, if we think about, well, the cloud option, how cloud is cloud. So SAP give you almost 3 different cloud deployment options. Now, the first one is something called the SAP S4 Public Cloud Edition. It really rolls off the tongue, but is essentially a software as a service. Now, this is SAP's public offering. They provide you with a software as a service box, but you can barely make any customization options. In fact, we have seen some customers relying upon SAP to actually design and maintain the security and the access to their S4HANA system. Now, if you have an audit and there are segregation of duties or there's access risks around that, you don't necessarily have much control around that security option. So you're potentially outsourcing that management to SAP, and you're hoping that they can manage that for you. Now, there's the second option, which is a little bit of a hybrid between the purely sort of on-premise and the software as a service option, the public cloud, is called the S4 Single Tenant Edition, or Private Cloud Hosted, or HEC for short. Now, this is a dedicated SAP hosted environment. It does allow you to be able to provide some level of customization, but you do then get to manage your security design concepts around that. But they do then provide you with some of the support around the patching and the upgrades. So from a vulnerability standpoint, that is fairly well controlled. Now, the third option, and one of the most popular for the really large enterprises, is the externally hosted, or the on-premise type edition, or partner managed cloud. So what organizations are doing here is they're going to Azure, they're going to AWS or Google to host their servers there, but they have total control and autonomy. It's just from a platform or an infrastructure perspective, they've outsourced that risk and management to those people. Then you have to consider the SAP cloud applications. SuccessFactors, Ariba, Concur, Fieldglass, Analytics Cloud, the Cloud Identity and Access Governance Solutions. There's a fairly endless list of the applications that you can now subscribe to on a cloud platform basis. So then how do you integrate those cloud applications with your on-premise or your hybrid HEC environments? Those are the things where you have to start thinking about, well, there potentially is a need for the SAP cloud platform. Architecturally, it is quite complex, and it does require a lot of assessment, especially when considering some of the risks around the access to these applications. So very important that you pick the right option for the environment. Otherwise, it could have a significant impact on the overall TCO, but also the overall security risk profile of those architectural decisions. So what does this mean for security? So of course, we've already talked about the approach. So do you have the right tools in place to be able to design your security concepts and the access profiles? Who has responsibility for that? Are you outsourcing that responsibility to somebody that hopefully knows what they're doing? Or do you have the in-house skill set to be able to do that? Also, what is the current scope of change? So which elements from ECC to S4 HANA are you still going to be using or adopting? What are the underlying processes around that? What are some of the master data governance that you're putting in place to ensure that the master data being shared from function to function, from S4 system to S4 system? So you need to start considering the overall business processes and the differing ways in which the data is shared across those functions and deployments. You then need to think about the cloud deployment. So the cloud versus on-premise, pretty much what we talked about in the previous slide. Then there's also the user interface. So the Fiori front-end servers. Are you going to be centralizing those from a gateway perspective? So putting them into a DMZ, being able to have a centralized Fiori launchpad to go across all the different cloud applications, but also the on-premise? Or are you going with the embedded option? How are you then going to manage the Fiori catalogs or the Fiori applications and synchronize those with the back-end roles? Now, I'll be touching upon that later on, about the back-end role synchronization with how you can then access the Fiori applications on the front end. So you need to maintain those Fiori apps to the back-end transactions and authorizations that people are going to have. So what has actually changed in S4HANA security? The user interface, Fiori. I've already started to touch upon this around the Fiori launchpad. So in general, they've simplified the overall user experience. So they've moved away from some of the battleship grey screens that you've got to a little bit more mobile friendly way of navigating through the applications. However, there are still elements within an organization which will still want to adopt the SAP GUI. So still being able to use transaction-based access to specific applications or functional areas. So really it does depend upon the different access points that the organizations are going to be allowing across that. To be quite honest with you, the majority of organizations are actually going with a hybrid approach. So a lot of people within finance are still typically using the transaction code to access specific areas of SAP rather than using Fiori. But a lot of the end users who typically don't interface with SAP on a daily basis, who aren't used to the back-end T-code access, they're actually adopting the Fiori Launchpad. So there is a bit of a hybrid approach at the moment to the overall user interfaces that are being used. Now, there are also technical challenges. Now, the code base has changed. They've completely simplified the overall data grid approach, or the data view approach, by using this in-memory HANA database. It also means that there are some of the trusted transactions that people have been using over the many years, some of them have been removed. Now, you can find that out using the simplification list, but there are thousands and thousands of these transactions that have been removed or replaced. Some of the functional areas have actually been merged, lost, or simply replaced by something else. Now, because SAP is now providing you with an SAP database platform as well, the whole database management has also changed. So now some of those DB admins need to understand the actual HANA data views. You need to start setting up some of those HANA data views to access some of the underlying data. So those that are fairly well versed around the database architecture of Oracle, of JD Edwards, IBM DB2, well, they need to start sort of skilling up around the HANA database views as well. Now, if you look at the overall business processes, I touched upon this really at the very start of the webinar. Now, with the simplification list, the merging of some of the functional areas or some of the functional areas being replaced, well, the underlying business processes will have to change. It's simple. It has to change, because if you've lost a functional area or it's been merged into another area, then you need to redesign those business processes and the processes around how you access those new functional areas. Now, SAP does deliver templated business roles and templated business processes out there, but they inherently carry access risk. They haven't appropriately broken down the overall critical access risks, and as well there is inherent SODs within these business roles. So really, organizations, even if they're going with a brownfield thinking they can technically lift and shift what they have already, there will be an element where they are mandated to redesign the processes because they have changed and they cannot continue as they did in ECC. And so the whole security design concept also needs to be redesigned to match. So those are some of the major fundamental changes. Now, if we look at the user interface perspective, Fiori, for example, so you can see the example of what the Fiori Launchpad looks like, all rather snazzy when put side by side with the SAP NetWeaver Business Client, for example. Now, what security managers are having to think about is, well, how are we then managing the Fiori groups and the Fiori catalogs, and then assigning those applications to the back-end roles so that people can use it? Now, actually, if you end up with a centralized gateway model, which reduces the overall security risk because you're not exposing your underlying HANA system to the internet, for example, then that actually increases and doubles the amount of security maintenance required, because you now need to maintain the role and application access on the front end, so at the gateway level, but also on the back end within the S4 HANA, and then synchronize those. So that is duplicating the amount of security required. So if we look at the very, very high level here, but we look at the ECC security concept. You have a person, let's say a purchasing clerk, who has access to the transaction code ME21, and then they have actions where they can actually create things specific to a specific company that they are assigned to. You then maintain the role menus, and then they finally had access to the SAP GUI. So how does that change when we look at the S4 HANA security concept? Well, ME21 has changed, not changed terribly far, but now you've got ME21N. So fundamentally, the transaction code has now changed. You can still assign the actions as you do in PFCG, so the create and the companies that they can access. But now you have to assign the Fiori catalogs, or the Fiori apps that they can access relating to the transaction code ME21N and also the business processes that they can access. On top of that, if you have the centralized gateway approach, you now have to maintain that on the front end, but also maintain that role concept on the back end as well. And then finally, they have the Fiori Launchpad. Oh, and by the way, the Fiori Launchpad itself also needs to be maintained as well. So if we visualize almost all of these nested security layers in S4 HANA, well, you obviously start out with the groups, the Fiori groups, for example. You then have the apps that are assigned within those groups, or the catalogs. So you then start assigning all of these different apps within the catalogs. You then have the PFCG, so you've got the master roles, which you're maintaining on the back and the front end, and you're maintaining the assignments of the Fiori apps, the groups, over into the back end and the front end. And then finally, you're able to create those derived roles from those master roles that you've maintained within PFCG. And then those users can then get assigned to those Fiori catalogs, as well as those Fiori master roles. So what has stayed the same? Well, depending upon the questions that you've probably been asking yourself throughout and how you've answered those in your head, it's probably worthwhile at this point, you may be telling me. We'll be having a little bit of a Q&A later on in our virtual summit. But really, have you changed the overall architecture? Have you changed the deployment methods? Have you chosen to change any of the business processes? Which of the business processes are you being forced to have to redesign? Do you have any control requirements? Are there any new controls that you have to implement as a result of the changing business processes and the different ways in which you can interact and engage with the S4HANA system? And have regulators or auditors changed their opinion on the need to govern the overall business and the processes? So when you start thinking about those, actually you probably start to think, well, there's actually a lot less that you can borrow and leverage from ECC into S4. There is an awful lot that has changed. So the view from the coalface, this is the common pitfalls. There are the technical issues. There is definitely business change in particular areas, project scope. Quite often the security aspect is lost. The reason why is when you have business analysts who are looking or owning the overall business process designs, they aren't thinking about the multiple entry points and the way in which you need to properly segregate and control access across these business processes. So users, the actors who are going to be accessing particular areas of the S4 typically will have carte blanche access. So unless those business analysts have a security design thinking cap on, and they understand the complexities and the potential critical access risks inherent within some of the processes, then they won't necessarily know how to redesign those processes. So they're going to need significant support from the security teams to appropriately design and segregate the access so that you reduce the overall risk in somebody being able to fraudulently do things within S4HANA or access things that they shouldn't have. And then finally, you're probably starting to get a feel for maybe we're failing to learn from the lessons of the past. And I'll touch upon that later on. So the technical issues. So really, it's very, very simple for the end users, and they don't really need to care about the actual way in which they engage with the system. But S4HANA security is a bit like a duck. Above the surface is all looking really calm. End users are able to access applications, hopefully without error. But below the surface, we are paddling like hell to maintain all of these links. There are multiple components, many different access points that we talked about: mobile, laptop, HANA, Fury, the HANA database views, the ability to still use SAP GUI, the different maintenance links. There's an awful lot to think about. When you look at the specific HANA challenges, well, the HANA access is actually maintained completely separate to PFCG. You actually need to maintain your own HANA template users and roles, and it's completely different. So it's actually done within the HANA platform itself. There's no synchronization that can be done. Now, there are some common pitfalls around the database access, specifically when it comes to people who are hard coding some of the authorizations in at the database level. But also, there's no governance that is inbuilt around the admin related access and the different HANA views that people can set up. So if you are a HANA DB admin, you potentially have the ability to create all of these different profiles with elevated access and being able to access the underlying data directly within the HANA database view. And it doesn't matter how many controls you have at the application level, somebody can still go in directly into the database, extract what information they need, and then come out. And it's completely circumvented the controls that are applied at the application layer. So HANA database views, the HANA roles, need specific and separate governance procedures in place to manage that. The business processes, as you can see from the current screenshot, the general ledger accountant, that is an off-the-shelf business role that is assigned or is available for the accounting and financial close business process. So if an organization adopted the best practice, as SAP call them, of the business processes and the business roles, well, you can start to see inherently they have far too much access, wide-ranging access for one business role, and they really need to be split up and segregated. So if you are adopting the off-the-shelf business processes and business roles, please ensure that you are looking from a security perspective at how you can segregate those and have different iterations of these general ledger accounts based upon the security design principles. But similar to R3, SAP have released the best, as they call it, the best practice business processes and business roles. Again, with the same inherent access risks that R3 typically had as well. Then it comes to the project scope. We have experienced many times where we've had to go in and rescue some of the security aspects of S4HANA implementations. Now, what has typically happened is an organization has redesigned the processes, or they've leveraged the standard processes that come with SAP. They've gone live, and then they've realized, hold on, either people have far too much access, we can't control the access, or audit has found some of these issues, or users don't have enough access. So we have ended up going in and then having to try and remediate a lot of these standard roles after the project has gone live, after the success criteria of end users having a real simple approach to being able to use S4HANA. We've gone in and then had to do a lot of the remediation exercise, which ultimately will end up with regret cost. Now, you can significantly save on that regret cost by actually looking at the security aspect when you are implementing either your brownfield or greenfield S4. Don't just consider your S4 deployment as technical and security is completely non-functional and it's just a technical upgrade and everyone will have access. It really isn't. Regardless of whether it's a brownfield or a greenfield deployment option, you must have a security track in there that is supporting some of those business processes and actually filling in where there's going to be some of those access risks along the way. So you are designing your roles as per the business processes, not designing the roles, not splitting out some of those roles after you've gone live with S4 and after there's a whole heap of pain around that remediation. So when you look at the overall skill set of security professionals, well, they kind of need to transition in and out and interface with lots of different teams. So the security professionals really need to have the hat on of basis. They need to be able to think from an audit or an assurance point of view. Will this role cause me a problem? Will there be findings? Does this role need to be remediated? They also need to liaise very closely with some of the subject matter experts, especially those who are owning the business processes. You also need to engage with the application or functional experts, the solution architects who are thinking about the deployment options, integrating with the various cloud applications. So security professionals really need to interweave and sort of interlace amongst all of these different skill sets and being able to pull it together from a security by design perspective. Now, it's also important to try and think about how you include the overall governance into an S4 project. So you think about, well, what remediation or what role splitting or segregation do we need to do if we're opting for an S4 standard business process and business roles that are delivered from SAP? What about the Fury, the service authentications that are required? How are you going to be federating those front-end servers? How are you then defining your cross-system risks and then implementing controls to mitigate that? What about the HANA access privileges? So we touched upon the ability to access the HANA database directly because the roles are maintained directly within HANA and not within PFCG. So there's another area that needs to be maintained. And then, of course, there's all the different application components, the cloud, the non-SAP cloud solutions, like Workday, Salesforce, etc. So there's an awful lot to consider around the impact of overall risks and the controls, and being able to make sure that you can validate the overall access risks and the business impacts if you intend to try and base your implementation on templated content from either SAP or a systems integrator. And then finally, we are ending up really failing to learn the lessons of the past. We're seeing it time and time again that the S4 HANA migration is being treated purely as a technical exercise, and the security is being considered as a non-event. We can simply technically upgrade and then we're live. And really that comes down to because there's a lack of security domain expertise. And just from a budget perspective, security is being de-scoped either by the systems integrator or by the customers themselves, and actually de-scoping the security, thinking we'll fix this as we go. But actually, audit are typically finding a lot of these issues post go live, but also the end users are also suffering because they've either got too much or too little access. The worst thing that you can do is have a user trying to access a Fury app that is present on their Fury launchpad. They try to click it, but it tells them that there is an error. The error is fairly nondescript, and it doesn't tell them that there is an authorizations issue, which is why they cannot access that application. That is the worst case scenario here for implementing S4 and not thinking about the security aspect. So going way back to the late 90s with R3, they delivered business processes and the technical access to be able to access them, but then all of the customizations that then required were just forgotten. And so it ended up yet again, and we're still doing it today, even with ECC and S4, all of those remediation projects, because they were never right in the first place. So now we come to the tips and the tricks. S4 HANA Security Task Checklist. If there's one thing to take away from today, these are all the responsibilities within the security track of any S4 HANA project that you should be focusing on. So whether that is looking to outsource and bring somebody external in to support your security track, either systems integrator, turnkey, or an external contractor, or you're trying to develop that skill set in-house, these are all of the high-level responsibilities of a security lead that you really need to try and make sure there is proper ownership throughout. So these are really the key focus areas for anybody within the security track of any organization. So you're looking to try and support the overall influencing of the architectural deployment option. If you are not part of that and somebody is making the decisions based upon just the business processes and not thinking about it from the security and the access point of view, you really need to go in and influence that. You need to tell them that as a result of embedding the overall Fury gateway into S4HANA, you're increasing the overall external security risk. But then if you go ahead and centralize the Fury gateway, then you're actually doubling the maintenance, the security maintenance. So you might need a bigger security team to then support you, but your overall external risk is then reduced. You also need to support the evaluation of the processes and the supplementing roles. So what business processes are being retained by the organization? Ask the business analysts, ask the business owners. Try and then start understanding the different access points that are being designed in there. And then actually having those conversations about, well, hold on, we need to think about the overall security and the access and the risks around the different pieces of access, especially if you're using some of the standard templating provided by SAP. If you are lifting and shifting anything, so you're going the brownfield route, and you're trying to lift some of the existing security concept from ECC into S4HANA, well, use this opportunity to clean and remove a lot of the unused T codes from those old accesses. So you can actually do a cleanup exercise whilst you look to refresh, because some of those T codes have changed. Like what you saw earlier in the webinar, ME21 is now ME21N. So you know that there is that clean and replace cycle that you need to do. And really, really low effort, but a major priority. Educate business process analysts on the overall design concepts that will affect security. If you can get them to think about the security design principles when they're thinking about how to design the processes, then at least that'll have that good conversation as to, well, am I introducing risk by designing the process in this way? And similarly, educate some of the user experience designers or the app developers. If there's any custom Fury apps that are being developed, they need to know about the security principles as well. Don't go in and hard code some of those authorizations directly within the application, because then you have absolutely no governance jurisdiction over the top of that. So try and establish the boundaries and the responsibilities for when those Fury apps get customized and published. Then think about establishing those governance processes. The privileged and emergency access accounts, so typically firefighter, or if you've got a separate privileged access management solution that you're looking to implement, establish some of those governance processes over the top of that. Again, try and establish some of the governance around the role creation. If you can, try and embed the risk analysis whenever there is a new role created. Try and do that risk analysis at the point of the role creation or the role change, because then you're able to identify when new risks might come in. If you don't have the right tools to be able to do that, you have no idea if you are continually introducing brand new risks because you've got no automated tooling doing that. Also think about the Fury app role assignment. So how you're actually maintaining the groups and the catalogs and then assigning those Fury apps to the back-end roles. And then importantly, establish that audit profiling, at least on the HANA database layer. It sits well outside of PFCG, completely separate governance process around maintaining of HANA access. Then there is the maintenance of the back-end and the front-end roles, which I touched upon before around the architectural decisions. So if you go ahead with that centralized gateway, you will be duplicating the maintenance. So think about the overheads that are going to be required and the teams required. And then finally, as with any remediation project that follows and any well-controlled environment, establish those mitigating and compensating controls, at least for pre-production and production environments. So at Turnkey, we have developed some security accelerators that might actually help you in reducing the overall total cost of ownership, but also improve your overall risk posture when it comes to the security stream of any S4HANA project. So we've got both delivered content, so that is content that we deploy into your environment to speed things up, but we also have some process accelerations as well. If you look at how you can enable secure migration in a brownfield approach, we've got an ECC to S4 T code library. So I touched upon some of those ECC codes, and now some of them are defunct. There's around about 20 to 30% of transaction codes have fundamentally changed. If you look at SAP, there is a simplification list, but you have to manually comb through that. So we've done all of that lifting already. There's also an ECC role migration and usage cleanup. So if you are looking to leverage your existing SAP security design concept from ECC and bring as much as you can over into S4HANA, we've actually got a migration and usage cleanup tool that can help. From a greenfield and a brownfield perspective, we've also got an S4HANA golden risk rule set. So if you are trying to establish some of those governance processes to do the risk analysis of any new roles, then we actually have a risk rule set ready and able to go for any of the GRC solutions that you may have and you're looking to embed into the S4HANA role process. We also have a project kickoff and discovery accelerator. A lot of organizations who kick off the S4HANA transformation are left scrabbling around thinking about, well, what do we need to think about in security? So we've actually got a kickoff and discovery accelerator, which asks all of the pertinent questions and asks for all the information upfront in advance in a really easy to digest format. So at least that supports a lot of the kickoff process, and you can reduce the overall kickoff of the security stream from 4 to 6 weeks down to just a couple by using that accelerator. Then we proactively have remediated a lot of the risks. So again, with some of the delivered content, I've touched upon SAP's pre-delivered content of standard business roles. We've actually gone ahead and cleaned up and segregated a lot of those roles. So we've got some of these business roles ready to go and segregated from a risk perspective. We've also put together a security design principle training pack for business analysts, business process owners, and application developers. So we can start embedding some of that security by design principle thinking into the way in which they are designing those processes and access points. We've also supported organizations around hardening that database and UI layer security. So we've got a set of database audit profile templates, again, just establishing that governance process at the HANA database level, which there's absolutely nothing out there to support you at the moment. That is having to be developed from scratch. So we've got content that can plug into that and start building out these templates for you. And then on top of that, we've also got the Fiori catalog and group security training. The way in which users are having to access the Fiori applications on the Fiori Launchpad has fundamentally changed. If you are a security experienced professional looking at the ECC, SAP GUI, NetWeaver stack, you may not know how to manage and maintain the Fiori apps and then the synchronization between that. So we have developed some training to accelerate that understanding and the ability to maintain Fiori assignments to back-end transactions. So, in summary, S4HANA brings significant opportunity to enhance and improve the overall operational environment. If you do want to adopt additional business transformation, make sure you understand the changes you intend to make. The big success criteria around S4HANA is the simplified, more improved end user experience. If you are causing frustration for the end user community when they're trying to access applications but they're getting generic authorization access issues, that is not providing them with a good user experience, and that success criteria will fail. The security designs will need to be adapted to suit the changes to business processes, changes to T codes and authorization concepts, and the different access points. And put quite simply, security is not a non-event. It is not a functional requirement. It is imperative that there is a security stream in any S4HANA transformation program. If you want to know any more, we do have various blogs available for you to read at your leisure. You can go on our website and you can find that, or find us on LinkedIn, and we regularly post these. We also have an ebook called Safety First, a guide securing your S/4HANA implementation, which goes into more detail and is similarly along the same lines of this webinar. You can digest that at your leisure, and it is a good ebook or white paper to then forward around to the rest of the organisation. I've been Cavan Arrowsmith. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope this has been useful. If you want to get in touch, my contact details are on the screen. It'd be great to hear from you. Thanks very much.